Waking Up to Serenity, Unlocking the Door to Emotional Sobriety by Angelo. Chapter 4, Higher Power. If I am going to let go of being me and continue to exist, then something else must have to arise from within my consciousness to replace my personal sense of existence. Turning our attention away from the cart of personal ego self, we now need to focus on the horse. In order to nourish our metaphorical horse, we first need to understand what the driving force in our lives really is. I'm going to provide a picture of the higher power, which may be useful in seeking this understanding. The picture is akin to a jigsaw and is comprised of just 4 pieces. These next chapters cover each piece of the jigsaw in turn. Once we have all 4 pieces, then we can put them together and the picture will come into view. In my experience, I find that the best place to start when seeking such understanding is with science. This is the first piece in the puzzle. Our cultures place so much emphasis on science that we often find it difficult to accept any idea unless it can be proved scientifically. It's likely that we may all have different concepts of a higher power, but it's important to acknowledge that it is our conceptions that differ rather than the higher power itself. There is only one higher power, but we each conceive of it differently. We only have to look at the landscape of religion to see how ideas and beliefs vary enormously. This should not concern us. If we are going to move from reluctant belief in a higher power to absolute certainty, then it has to make sense in the context of scientific understanding, however imperfect that may be. The science that I'm about to explain is very basic, and some of it probably already familiar to you. What we may not have fully appreciated is the enormous implications of the knowledge that we already have. The building blocks of the material world are the chemical substances set out in the periodic table of elements. Each chemical element is an atom comprised of various numbers of protons, neutrons, and electrons. The number of protons in the nucleus determines the atomic number, and the number of electrons typically equals the number of protons. The periodic table of elements simply sets out the various configurations of atoms that arise, starting with hydrogen as atomic number 1 and ending with something called lawrencilium as atomic number 103. So hydrogen is our most basic atom, with a single proton being orbited by a single electron. Obviously atoms are minuscule, but if we look into the relative scale of the components, then an astonishing picture emerges. If the proton were, let's say, a tennis ball in your hand, then the electron would be the size of a full stop in this book, and amazingly it would be 2 kilometers away and orbiting at that distance. The 2 kilometer gap is just empty space. So the proton and the electron make up a tiny fraction of what we call an atom. Indeed, any atom is comprised almost entirely of empty space. This understanding is already incredible, but it gets even more bizarre. There are several sophisticated particle accelerators in the world where scientists smash atoms together in order to break them up and study the outcome. Over 200 different subatomic particles have been discovered so far that combine to build the basic components of an atom, and new discoveries are still being made. What's most interesting is that these infinitesimally small fragments turn out not to be permanent particles at all, but instead are what we might call vibrations or waves. It's difficult for us to comprehend or visualize how a vibration or wave can possibly be a particle. The easiest way that I've found is simply to draw a wave on a piece of paper. Notice that the wave has peaks and troughs. If we assign the value of +1 to the peaks and -1 to the troughs, then the total wave adds up to 0. Let's say that the peaks of the wave are when a particle appears, and the troughs are when it disappears. We then have a wave that creates the momentary appearance of a particle. A good example here is the effect of a strobe light. When the strobe light pulses at low frequency, it appears as a flashing light, but when the frequency gradually increases, it eventually appears as permanent light. The same idea can be applied to subatomic particles. The frequency of the wave is so high that the peaks seem to become permanent, and the particle seems to exist. However, the appearance is an illusion, because what's really present is a wave rather than an actual particle. This idea has been proven scientifically by what is known as the double slit experiment, which, believe it or not, was first performed in 1801, but has been repeated numerous times since. The experiment basically proves that particles behave as waves, and the conclusions form the basis of the established scientific principle of wave-particle duality. Returning to our atom of hydrogen, we find not only that the atom is comprised almost entirely of empty space, but that the seemingly physical components of the atom are themselves vibrations or waves that have no permanence. The atom is an appearance rather than an actual thing. The entire seemingly real physical universe is comprised of atoms. Science is telling us that it is all a momentary appearance rather than a physical reality. This conclusion is profoundly shocking, but nevertheless is firmly established and accepted as scientific fact. The atomic chemical elements are the building blocks of the universe, but most of the physical substances that we encounter are comprised of molecules. A molecule is simply a specific combination of atoms. The way that atoms combine is that the orbits of the electrons overlap, a bit like a Venn diagram. The atoms sit alongside each other and the orbits intertwine and form a unit that we call a molecule. If we move up the periodic table to atomic number 8, we arrive at oxygen. An atom of oxygen has 8 protons and 8 orbiting electrons, but the same principles of scale and vibration apply as for hydrogen. If we take 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen and overlap the orbits, then we create a molecule of H2O. H2O is, of course, commonly known as water in the English language. There's no doubt that we experience water as a physical reality. The trouble is that we've just proved, scientifically, that H2O is an appearance rather than an actual substance. To recap, minuscule vibrations create the momentary apparent appearance of subatomic particles, which combine to form atoms of hydrogen and oxygen, which in turn combine to form a molecule of H2O. Science tells us so, yet we overlook the science in favour of our experience, which is that water is a physical substance. This is difficult enough to take on board, but it gets worse when we introduce the phenomenon of temperature into the equation. Temperature itself is a form of vibration. When H2O vibrates at room temperature, it appears as water, but at lower temperatures it becomes ice. Likewise, at higher vibration it becomes water vapour or steam. So we now have a molecule of H2O appearing either as a gas, liquid or solid, depending on its ambient temperature. It's the same molecule, but its appearance and properties are vastly different. We take all of this for granted, without grasping the profound implications. We assign words in our language to these various states, such as steam, water, snow, frost and ice. And these words add a further layer of credibility to our experience because the thing now has a name, and having a name must mean that it really is a thing. Science is telling us clearly that there are no things, but we continue to believe that there are. The key word here is believe. We will return to the subject of water in a later chapter, but for now there's just one more observation to make. Your physical body is roughly 60% H2O. The remaining 40% is also comprised of chemical elements and molecules, which ultimately are all subatomic vibration. We identify very strongly with our bodies. Indeed, most of us believe that we are our bodies. Little wonder that we have so much difficulty in letting go of the personal self-identity. Science has already proven that our bodies are an appearance rather than a physical fact. But, once again, our personal experience overrides the scientific explanations. This first piece of the jigsaw puzzle is intended to seriously challenge the materialistic worldview. We tend to think of the material world and the unknown spiritual world as two distinct realms. The truth is that there is only one. The material world is what appears to arise out of what we call the spiritual world. The material world is a manifestation of the spiritual. And we are each part of the material world, so therefore we are each a manifestation of spirit. This conclusion may be reluctantly inescapable, but it also turns out to be the most wonderful news possible.